Do you love getting multiple ideas for the same stamp set? Hi, I'm Jess from JessCrafts.com and I'm here to help you make the most of your crafty supplies and time. So let's get making. Today I have one background stamp, and this one actually comes with a sentiment too, and I'm going to show you 5 different cards with this same background stamp, and you can use any background stamp. This one happens to be a Slimline one from scrapbook.com called Mod Trees, but you could use a 6x6 background stamp or, any size that you have. I'm going to be putting my stamp in my MISTI to do my stamping. I do think that when you're stamping a large background stamp, it can be really nice to be able to get multiple impressions. So I like having a stamp press tool to do that with. And you have to make sure that if this is a clear stamp, background stamp. I know a lot of background stamps are red rubber, so you'd have to take the insert out of your MISTI. And then something else that I think is going to be helpful in this situation is a sticky mat that you can put down on your MISTI. So I have this one also from scrapbook.com because, as you guys know, I love scrapbook.com. If I'm ever making a purchase, they're like the first place I check. And a lot of times I will even, maybe I see it somewhere else, but it's out of stock, and then scrapbook.com has it. And so, or they'll have a freebie or something like that. And so ultimately my order will go to scrapbook.com because they carry so much if I want multiple things, from different companies, whatever. But anyway, so we're just going to put this, it's a sticky mat, and it's going to be able to hold my cardstock down so that I don't need the magnets for the MISTI. And I don't know that all stamp tools require a magnet, but if yours does, they can kind of get in the way. And there's other things you can do. You can totally take tape and tape it down. So there, I put it on my sticky mat. But say I didn't have this sheet from scrapbook.com, I could simply take one and then use something like a low tack tape and tape my mat down, or roll some tape behind it. There's other choices, but I just wanted to, because I was going to be using it so often and I'm going to be stamping multiple times with this stamp, I wanted to make life easy for myself. And now I could take the magnets and use the magnets to hold the plastic sheet down. All right, let's get into our first idea. We could just stamp a background. I'm going to be stamping on white because when I create my Slimline cards, I take an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper and I cut it so it's 8.5 by 7, and this is the leftover piece, which can be perfect for creating a card and then creating a card front and then attaching it to your card. So I have some Noble Fur ink from Fawn. I'm going to share some thoughts on how to get pretty good impression with this large stamp. So stamp conditioning can be very helpful. That can be something as simple as just rubbing your hand on it and just trying to pull off some of that residue. You could use a rubber eraser, you could use a leather tool or a leather scrap. All of that can help to just kind of rub off some of the residue that comes in manufacturing when you have a brand new stamp. Also, just stamping it multiple times helps. Now, I'm going to be using Fawn ink cubes. It would probably be easier to have a larger stamp pad if you, in order to do stamping like this, because there's just so much surface area to cover, but I just don't have the room for that many large stamp pads in my craft room. So here I have my little ink cube, and traditionally you would kind of just tap the ink on. I find that when I do this tapping motion, some areas get missed, some areas bubble up, and so I find to get more coverage, the first thing that I like to do is actually very gently swipe the ink pad all across the surface. Now, this won't give you a traditional stamped impression, and in fact, this is a technique in and of itself, and we will talk about it later, but it does guarantee that there's ink on a good majority of the stamp now. Then I tap it. And now it's going to fix the texture. You're not going to have that swipe texture, but you're still going to have that good coverage because for the most part the ink's already there. You're just kind of filling in any gaps, giving it a nice strong coverage. Be careful. with your ink pads, they might have these little fuzzies that come off. I don't know if anyone else has this issue, but it always happens to me, and nothing is worse than like ruining an entire background because one of those fuzzies came off and you have to start again. Because as you can see, I'm doing this in real time just to give you perspective, and I'll probably speed some things up later, but how long it takes to cover a large background stamp with a small ink pad like this. Just in case that's an incentive, if you're like, actually, you're right, that has been driving me nuts. I should probably have larger ink pads. I think space-wise, it's probably worth it if you don't do a lot of large stamping like that. Okay. Now, I can already tell this isn't going to be a perfect first impression, even though I've tried to do some things to already mitigate that. Partly because this is a pretty solid stamp. I want to apply pressure. You can be above your stamp tool and press down. Give it good pressure that way. You could take a rag and have that help you to usually you can pull your sleeve down, but it's summertime here and it's way too hot for that. Even though I'm making a Christmas card, it's summertime. And I think in some ways that's a good time to make Christmas cards instead of in December when everything else is already happening. Last tip would be just to leave your stamp sitting there for longer than you expect. Don't just expect to quickly sort of tap it down and go. Let it rest for a few seconds. My next way of using this background stamp after just, plain solid stamping would be to use that swipe stamping and let that be the thing that adds interest to your card. So I have my solid stamp, but now I want to add a bit of texture to them. And this works well because there's some solid parts. The swipe stamping technique is less interesting on a stamp that's really kind of intricate or just has lines. But because this one has images, there is a place for you to do that swiping and to see that swiped texture. And I actually think it looks kind of cool with these trees in particular because it kind of looks vaguely like the idea of needles on the Christmas tree. It adds up a bit of that texture to it. So as you can kind of see there, that is what it would look like. I would keep stamping till it gets a little bit more solid, but that's the general idea is just to pull your ink pad down across. Make sure you're pulling pretty lightly because you don't really want to get it in the in-between areas, as then when you apply your pressure, you can get spots where you don't want it. On the inside portion of the stamp. You want to only be on the raised portion of the stamp. This technique with the swipe stamping is not going to be for everyone because if you keep going until you get really solid images, you're going to lose the look of the swiping. So you're going to want to be okay with it being imperfect. And as you can see there, the scrapbook.com mat made it really easy to peel it off, but it didn't shift at all when I was stamping. This kind of stamping I want to recommend is tone-on-tone stamping. So rather than stamping on a white background, stamp onto the same color of cardstock as the ink that you are using. So you can do that with white cardstock and a watermark ink, or you can do what I'm doing here where I'm keeping the trees green and I'm going to stamp green on green, and it's going to give you a pretty different look because it's going to make it feel a little bit more like a patterned paper. And this is not going to be a perfect impression, but it'll give you an idea and you'll see the more complete result when I assemble the cards at the end. But that is sort of a tone-on-tone look, which as you can see is quite different than the white-on-white. One other thing I wanted to note in case it was helpful is this is the Noble Fur ink from Lawn Fawn, still freshly stamped, and this has been dry for probably 24 hours or so at this point. So the color does change as it dries, and it usually kind of just comes back a little bit, like it's just a little bit lighter than when you first stamp it, and that can be something important to consider about color matching, and that's a reason to do swatching so that you can see what the dried color looks like versus the fresh color. Next thing I would recommend is ombre inking. I think that that adds a lot of interest very easily. I'm trying to keep this within the realm of not adding a lot of extra tools, just keeping it to your stamp set so that you're not having to buy a bunch of other things to create this effect. I am assuming that you have inks and cardstock because you're a stamper, but I realize, you know, some people are still building up their like other supplies in terms of, you know, maybe embossing powder or, you know, other additional things for techniques. So I'm going to start with a dark color at the bottom, and then I'm going to use lighter and lighter colors of green ink as I go. And I don't really have to mask anything off because I'm doing an ombre look, so I'm just kind of, the next chunk I'll ink up a different color. This actually can be another way to get good coverage, is by just inking a portion of your stamp at one time, so that when you have a really large stamp like this, it's not drying as you're applying the ink, so that by the time you get to applying the ink to the top of the stamp, it is already dried at the bottom and you're not going to get as good of a transfer. I am using, again, Lawn Fawn inks, and I chose Noble Fir, Cilantro, and Freshly Cut Grass. So cilantro is that mid-tone color there. And the freshly cut grass might wind up being a little bit brighter, but then again, that's okay because we toned it down by leaving our old ink up there. So yeah, it actually, the lightest color is kind of in the middle here, really, versus that. So it's going to be a bit of an experimentation, and again, that's another reason you ink swatch, because I could look at my swatch colors and go, actually, you know, maybe cilantro is not as dark as I thought it was, and then you could keep going and blending more and more until you get a really great impression here with your inks. For this next technique, you're going to have to actually clean your stamp. I'm not a big fan of cleaning stamps in general. They usually work just fine without being cleaned. And okay, anyway, what I'm doing over here is I am masking off a portion of the stamp. So I'm just going to be stamping this section of trees, and the rest of it's going to be blank. So I took some scrapbook.com mint tape and I went around the trees so that I was basically kind of deciding that this is the last row that would be shown. Now, this could be a little bit tricky because I'm going to use this mask where I apply the ink and then I remove this, and in order to ink it again, which I might need to do because it's a solid background stamp, I'm going to need to be able to put this back on. So that is why not only am I putting the little tape in that stair pattern, I'm taping the tape together because I want to be able to remove this whole piece and then put it back down to do additional inking as needed. So I'll try to show you what I mean by that. I'm going to be inking it up. As you see, I am clearly letting the ink get all over that mask, all over my mint tape there, and that's okay because we're going to peel that off. And be careful not to go beyond your mint tape too, and that's why it can be nice to have like a sort of generous barrier. I can pull that off and then stamp down just a portion. I definitely just realized that like it would be a mirror image. I thought it was going to be like that. I would have preferred, but here we are. You gotta, you know, like you should know that like stamps because they look backward, you know, the words and stuff, but I was not thinking of that. Okay, and so again, I want to add more ink because it's kind of splotchy, and now I can just line this mask back up and repeat the process. But that would have been hard if I left it in all those little pieces and did not do that larger mint tape across all of them. So this here is why I shouldn't talk and stamp at the same time. I definitely did not remove the mask. So I'll be starting again, but you guys still know the technique. Okay, we're ready to start finishing off these cards. So I've created a bunch of panels. There's my oops. You could totally cut around this and still use this. It doesn't have to become scrap, but I did a one that's the right way, just because part of the technique, or part of the video is showing you different techniques. So we have our ombre stamping, our tone-on-tone stamping, our solid on white stamping, our swipe stamping, and our selective stamping. Then we're ready to turn these into cards, and I am going to use the sentiment from the stamp set, because the idea is one stamp many ways, and rather than pulling in anything additional, especially in terms of stamps, I am going to stamp the sentiment from the stamp set. So I want this Believe in the Magic of Christmas. I'm going to do a tone-on-tone stamping, but I don't want to waste cardstock. I have this Slimline cardstock from scrapbook.com. It's in the warms range, and I'm going to use that behind my different stamped panels. So I'm going to cut these down, and then I'm going to leave a border around them with this pink cardstock or reddish cardstock, and pull the sentiment in by incorporating it as a matte border and as well as the sentiment. So I want to show you how I'm going to get this sentiment out of the center of this piece of paper. Not too complicated, but just, you know, review it for you guys. My sticky mat behind here again, although this time I have a lot more leeway to use my MISTI magnets, which are now stuck to the sticky bit, but that comes off as very, very light tack. And if you have additional questions about this sticky mat, scrapbook.com did a live stream where they answered a lot of the questions. I'm going to take my Believe in the Magic of Christmas sentiment stamp, and you know I told you I don't clean stamps, so that's dirty and stained, and that's how it's going to be. I was trying to figure out which way I can stamp it so it takes up the least amount of room. It does seem that it's slightly narrower this way, so that's why I'm stamping it sideways. Okay, so now that I have my sentiment stamped, I know it still looks a little bit blotchy, but things do smooth as they dry. Again, this is one that's been dry for 24 hours or so, and it's much more even looking, even though when I stopped stamping it was similar. And you might be thinking, why not just use like a circle or oval stamp, or sorry, circle or oval die cut and stamp on that? And with how little room there is on the edge, I wouldn't have been able to fit a circle or an oval. I really had to just fussy cut it. So I'm just doing what I don't know, we used to do this in school where like, if you wanted to cut something out of the middle, you needed to sort of get started by poking it. Please be careful. You know, it's not necessarily what your tool's meant to do. You can use something that's more of a like straight poke. Make sure your fingers are not in the way. Everything clear. Adults only. And poke through. Do the same thing with your scissor. Just be careful. Make sure there's nothing underneath that you're going to hurt. Your fingers are all clear, etc. I know I'm being a little bit like extra about that, but it's like on TV when they're always like, professional driver on a closed course, do not attempt, like you thought you were going to like do all the moves from the car commercial in your own vehicle, like, you know, zooming down the highway and all that. So I'm going to very loosely fussy cut it right now. So there's that hole in the middle, just like this hole in the middle, that's going to be covered up. And then I'm going to more closely sort of fussy cut around it. I do find that if you try to just take little dips in between details like these, I don't even know what you'd call them, the rays coming out of the Of Christmas, it makes it look a little bit more like an actual die cut, as there are often those details where if I were to go like smooth across the bottom, it would look totally fine. But it would look maybe a little bit more, just a little bit less detailed is what I'm trying to say. So I think trying as you can to just go a little bit more around the letters helps. Quickly walk through the assembly of one card, and then I'll show you what they all look like, because I'm using the same basic layout for all of them. As I mentioned, this is the scrapbook.com Slimline Cardstock Pack. This is from the Warms pack, I believe, but there's a couple of them and I have a couple, so sometimes I get them a little mixed up. But It's already cut perfectly to the 8.5 by 3.5 size that you need for slimline cards. And then, as we cut the sentiment out of the middle already, and then I'm gonna layer this up. And I cut this down slightly smaller, so it should be 8.25 by 3.5. My starting pieces were a lot bigger, but that's okay. I like to kind of have some extra room just in case, you know, it just gives you more forgiveness. Then I am going to add a strip across to ground my sentiment a bit. I think if I were to put my sentiment down, it would be fine, but I kind of would like something a little bit more solid around it. So that's why I'm adding this bit of dark green cardstock, and I believe that was 3 inches tall. And now I have some foam tape to add a little bit of interest. So then place that in the center there. And I'll show you the other cards as well. I'll show you the finished cards. I have the solid stamping, the swipe stamping, the tone on tone, ombre stamping, and the selective stamping. I think it'd be really cute to add some pops of color to these. And if you're going to do little pops of color, enamel type dots, it's going to do a couple practice dots first, just to make sure everything's flowing well. And then it's always a little bit scary when you go to the project. But I'm going to do on these ones where, like, if I really mess it up, I can peel this piece off and hopefully save my backgrounds. So let's give it a whirl. You basically want to create the look of enamel dots. You want to kind of try not to work it too much. And then they're going to look like little peaks. You do not want that. You want them to look like rounded dots. So you just want to tap them down. And then they'll get a lot more rounded. Be a little more firm in your tapping. And they'll kind of come down even a little bit more. If you found this video inspiring, here's another video where you can find more ideas for enjoying your crafty time and supplies. Let me know you like this video with a share to your crafty community, subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next template or tutorial, and check the video description for product links. See you in the next video!